Understood. Part 9 will function as a silent emotional landing rather than a conventional ending. The entire narrative from Part 1 through Part 8 will be structured to naturally converge toward one restrained but deeply satisfying cinematic moment built through visual callbacks, emotional tension, and quiet transformation. The final emotional release will not come from revenge speeches, dramatic apologies, or explicit explanations. Instead, it will emerge through subtle behavior shifts, restrained body language, symbolic objects, silence, eye contact, unfinished gestures, and environmental atmosphere. The emotional architecture will follow this progression: humiliation, observation, mystery, silent resistance, hidden authority, reversal, emotional collapse, quiet dignity. Claire's characterization will remain controlled and unreadable throughout most of the story, so that the audience constantly questions who she truly is. Ethan's arc will not be about becoming good, but about losing the illusion that power makes him untouchable. The final scene in Part 9 will therefore not celebrate victory loudly. It will linger on a small human detail that quietly proves something inside him has changed. The silver pen, the rain, the untouched glass, the lowered eyes, or a simple hesitation before speaking may all function as emotional symbols that carry accumulated meaning from earlier parts. The last line will not explain a lesson. It will simply echo emotionally after the silence. Every upcoming part will therefore prioritize cinematic restraint, visual tension, and emotional payoff through implication rather than exposition. "Careful with that pen," the billionaire said without looking up from his glass. "It costs more than your entire paycheck." The silver fountain pen spun once across the polished marble floor before stopping beside Claire Whitmore's black heels. Around her, laughter rose softly beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers and gold-tinted lighting. Expensive laughter, the kind meant to make someone smaller. Claire bent down slowly and picked up the pen between slender fingers, her movements calm, almost elegant despite the white waitress uniform and narrow black apron tied neatly around her waist. "Of course, sir," she said quietly. Her voice carried no irritation.
"No embarrassment."
That seemed to bother Ethan Calloway more than if she had argued. The dining room of Valmont House overlooked Midtown Manhattan like a private kingdom floating above the city. Rain crawled down the massive windows in silver lines while men in tailored suits discussed mergers worth hundreds of millions of dollars over aged bourbon and imported steak. Claire moved silently between them with a tray balanced carefully against one hand, her blonde hair pinned back low at the nape of her neck. She looked like someone trying very hard not to be noticed. But Ethan noticed everything, especially people who refused to react. "Another glass," he said suddenly, sliding his crystal tumbler toward the edge of the table without looking at her. Claire reached for it smoothly before it tipped over. "Macallan 18?" she asked. Ethan finally lifted his eyes from the contract in front of him. Cold gray eyes, sharp enough to make junior executives sweat through six-figure suits. "At least the waitress remembers something." One of the investors chuckled awkwardly. Another looked down at his plate. Claire poured the whiskey carefully. The amber liquid caught the chandelier light like fire. Ethan watched her wrist as she moved.
"Nose-checking. No nervousness."
Strange. Most employees at Valmont House became clumsy around him within minutes. "You always this serious?" he asked. Claire placed the bottle down gently. "Only when people are watching, sir." A few heads lifted at that. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. There it was again. Not attitude exactly. Something quieter. Controlled. Like she knew a joke nobody else understood. "You think you're clever?" he asked. "No, sir," Claire replied. "I think I'm working." Silence brushed briefly across the table before one of the board members changed the subject and began discussing acquisition percentages again. Claire stepped away, heels soft against the dark floor, but Ethan's gaze followed her longer than necessary. Near the service station, another waitress whispered under her breath. "What was that about?" Claire picked up a fresh linen cloth and folded it once. Perfect corners. Perfect lines. "Nothing," she said. But across the dining room, Ethan was still staring. Outside, thunder rolled low over Manhattan. Inside, glasses clinked softly, while Claire adjusted the old silver watch on her wrist. It looked worn compared to everything around her. Not cheap. Just old enough to matter. As she turned back toward Ethan's table, she noticed one of the folders near his elbow had slipped partially open. A page inside showed a familiar company logo printed in dark blue ink. Hawthorne International. Claire's eyes paused for half a second. Then she kept walking. Ethan caught the pause immediately. "Problem?" he asked. Claire set down the appetizer plates carefully. "No, sir." Her eyes lifted toward him for the first time all night. Calm blue meeting cold gray beneath the chandelier light. "Just interesting reading material." Ethan smirked faintly. "Trust me, you wouldn't understand it." Claire gave the smallest nod imaginable and stepped back into the glow of the crowded restaurant while rain whispered against the windows high above the city. Somewhere behind her, Ethan clicked his silver pen open again. This time, he held onto it a little tighter. The rain had not stopped by midnight. Manhattan shimmered beneath the storm like a city trying very hard to hide its cracks. Inside Valmont House, the final dinner rush faded into quieter conversations and half-empty wine glasses while jazz drifted softly through hidden speakers in the ceiling. Claire Whitmore stood alone behind the service counter polishing silverware with slow, precise movements. Every fork aligned perfectly. Every knife placed at the exact same angle. "You know he has been watching you all night," said Naomi, another waitress, as she tied her coat around her waist. Claire did not look up. "Rich men watch everyone. Not like that." Naomi lowered her voice. "That Calloway guy looked personally offended that you did not worship him." Claire folded the cloth once more before setting it aside. "That sounds exhausting for him." Naomi laughed quietly and disappeared toward the employee lockers, leaving Claire alone with a soft clinking of glasses from the kitchen. Across the restaurant, Ethan Calloway remained at his table long after his investors had left. Most powerful men never sat alone willingly. They filled silence with meetings, phones, assistants, noise. Ethan only sat still when something bothered him, and Claire Whitmore was beginning to bother him. He loosened his dark tie slightly while reviewing the acquisition file spread across the table. Hawthorne International, the largest merger of his career. $48 billion. One signature away from making him untouchable inside the company. Yet his attention kept drifting toward the waitress near the service station. There was something wrong about her. Not dangerous, exactly. Just misplaced. Like seeing a violin in a machine shop. Claire collected empty glasses from nearby tables with quiet efficiency. She never rushed. Never lingered. The old silver watch remained loose against her wrist, catching flashes of chandelier light whenever she moved. Ethan noticed that too. He noticed details for a living. "Claire." His voice carried low across the nearly empty dining room. She turned immediately and approached the table. "Yes, sir?" Ethan tapped the open contract with one finger. "You recognized the Hawthorne logo earlier." "Not a question." Claire placed a water glass beside him carefully. "A lot of people recognize it. Not waitresses. Maybe you underestimate waitresses." Ethan leaned back slowly. "Maybe I do not enjoy being corrected by them." Claire said nothing. The silence stretched longer than comfortable. Rain pressed harder against the windows high above Park Avenue. Somewhere below, a siren echoed through the wet streets before disappearing again into the city. Ethan studied her face carefully now. Pale skin, controlled expression, intelligent eyes that revealed almost nothing. Most people tried too hard around powerful men. Claire did the opposite. She removed herself emotionally from the room, as if none of it impressed her. "Where did you learn about corporate acquisitions?" he asked suddenly. "I did not say I knew anything about acquisitions." "You paused when you saw the file." Claire adjusted one of the dessert plates near the edge of the table by less than an inch. Perfect alignment again. "Maybe I just like logos." Ethan almost smiled at that. "Almost. You always answer questions with questions?" "Only the unnecessary ones." For a second, the air between them changed. Sharper somehow. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the silver pen beside his glass. "You think you are smarter than everyone here." Claire looked toward the rain-covered windows instead of him. "No, sir," she said softly. "I just think some people speak too loudly when they are afraid." Ethan's expression hardened immediately. The room fell quiet again except for the ticking of the antique clock above the bar. Then Claire noticed something near the edge of the contract folder. A printed figure highlighted in red. Her eyes rested on it for less than a second before moving away. But Ethan saw that too. He saw everything. Interesting, he asked coldly. Claire reached for the empty whiskey glass. Only if the decimal point is supposed to be there. Ethan's eyes narrowed. The smile disappeared completely now. Outside, thunder rolled over Manhattan again. Inside Valmont House, for the first time that evening, Ethan Calloway closed the acquisition folder himself. By 1:30 in the morning, Valmont House had become almost silent. The investors were gone. The piano player had stopped an hour earlier. Only the muted sound of rain and distant traffic remained beneath the soft amber lights hanging above the empty tables. Claire Whitmore carried a tray of untouched dessert plates toward the kitchen while the cleaning crew polished the marble entrance near the elevators. Manhattan after midnight always felt different to her. Quieter. More honest. Rich people stopped performing once the audience disappeared. "You are still here?" Naomi asked while pulling on her coat near the employee exit. Claire nodded once. Closing paperwork. Naomi glanced toward Ethan's table across the dining room. And the billionaire? Ethan Calloway had not moved in nearly 20 minutes. His jacket hung over the back of his chair, while files remained spread across the table beside two empty whiskey glasses. He stared down at the acquisition numbers with the expression of someone trying very hard not to admit uncertainty. "Maybe he likes the lighting," Claire said softly. Naomi snorted a laugh.
No.
Men like him only stay when something bruises their ego. Claire did not answer. She simply returned to polishing the final wine glass beneath the service counter. Across the room, Ethan watched her reflection through the dark window beside him.
Calm.
Methodical. Completely unaffected by him. It irritated him more than he cared to admit. Most people wanted something from powerful men. Approval.
Fear.
Attention. Claire behaved as though his existence barely interrupted her evening. Ethan closed the contract folder sharply and stood from the table. The sound echoed lightly across the nearly empty restaurant. Claire looked up. "Kitchen is still open for another 15 minutes if you would like dessert," she said politely. Ethan walked toward her slowly, expensive shoes clicking softly against the dark floor. "You made a comment about the decimal point." Claire placed the wine glass upside down onto the shelf. "Did I?" "You know you did." "Maybe I was tired." Ethan stopped directly across from her now. Up close, he looked even more severe beneath the warm restaurant lighting. Sharp jaw. Tired eyes. The kind of face newspapers liked printing beside words like visionary and ruthless. "The acquisition report is confidential," he said carefully. Yet somehow a waitress spotted an accounting discrepancy in 3 seconds. Claire folded the polishing cloth neatly between her hands. "Maybe your accountants should be worried." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You think this is funny?" "No," Claire finally met his eyes again. "I think it is expensive." Silence settled heavily between them. Somewhere in the kitchen, dishes clinked softly. Rainwater rolled slowly down the enormous windows overlooking Lexington Avenue. Ethan studied her face again, trying to place something he could not explain. The posture, the diction, the way she observed before speaking. None of it matched the uniform she wore. Then his eyes drifted toward the small notebook partially tucked beside the register. Black leather. Simple. Neat handwriting visible across the top page. Financial figures. Ethan reached toward it automatically. Claire's hand moved first. Not aggressively. Just faster. She closed the notebook calmly and slipped it beneath the counter. Ethan noticed the title written briefly at the top before it disappeared. Internal risk exposure. His expression darkened instantly. "What exactly are you doing here?" he asked quietly. Claire remained perfectly still. "Serving tables. Do not insult my intelligence." "I would not dream of it, Mr. Calloway." Her voice stayed soft, respectful even. Somehow that made the tension worse. Ethan leaned one hand against the marble counter. "People hide things for 2 reasons," he said. "Fear or strategy." Claire glanced toward the rain outside. "Sometimes survival." For the first time all evening, Ethan did not have an immediate response. The city lights reflected faintly across the windows behind her, turning the storm outside into blurred rivers of gold and silver. Then his phone buzzed sharply in his pocket. Ethan glanced at the screen. A message from the board chairman. Emergency meeting. 8 a.m. mandatory attendance. Ethan frowned immediately. Claire noticed the shift in his expression without asking questions. She simply reached for his untouched silver pen still resting beside the whiskey glass and placed it gently in front of him. "You should probably get some sleep," she said quietly. Ethan picked up the pen slowly this time. His fingers lingered against the cool silver surface while his eyes remained fixed on Claire Whitmore. Outside, thunder rolled once more above Manhattan. Inside Valmont House, something invisible had already begun to change. At 7:45 the next morning, the rain finally stopped. Manhattan looked washed clean beneath a pale gray sky, while black SUVs lined the entrance of Hawthorne International like polished shadows. Ethan Calloway stepped out of the back seat, adjusting the cuff of his charcoal suit, his expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. The emergency board meeting had irritated him all night.
No agenda. No explanation.
Just mandatory attendance from every senior executive before market opening. That alone was unusual. Ethan entered the glass tower without slowing his stride. Employees straightened instinctively when he passed. Assistants lowered their voices. Security nodded immediately. This was his world. Predictable. Controlled. Nothing like the strange tension lingering from Valmont House the night before. Yet somehow, Claire Whitmore still occupied part of his thoughts. The decimal point. The notebook. The way she had looked at the acquisition file for half a second too long. Ethan removed his sunglasses inside the private elevator and stared briefly at his own reflection in the mirrored wall. People hide things for two reasons. The words returned to him uninvited. Fear or strategy. He disliked unresolved questions. The boardroom doors opened on the 42nd floor exactly at 8 o'clock. Inside, the atmosphere felt colder than usual. 12 executives sat around the long black table beneath soft recessed lighting.
No coffee cups. No casual conversation.
Just silence and neatly stacked folders placed in front of every seat. Ethan immediately noticed the chairman avoiding eye contact. Strange. What is this? Ethan asked while taking his chair near the center. No one answered immediately. Instead, the large screen at the front of the room flickered on softly. Hawthorne Internal Audit Review. Ethan frowned. You scheduled an emergency meeting for an audit presentation? The chairman adjusted his glasses nervously. Not exactly. Before Ethan could respond, the boardroom doors opened again behind him. Soft footsteps crossed the marble floor.
Come.
Unhurried. Ethan turned slightly in his chair, then stopped moving altogether. Claire Whitmore entered the room wearing a fitted white suit beneath a dark wool coat still damp from the morning rain. Her blonde hair was no longer pinned casually behind her neck. It rested neatly against her shoulders now, controlled and precise like everything else about her. The old silver watch remained on her wrist. The same watch from the restaurant, but somehow it looked different here. Belonged here. The entire room straightened subtly as she approached the head of the table. Ethan's expression hardened instantly. What is this? He repeated. Claire removed a pair of leather gloves slowly before placing a black portfolio onto the table. Good morning, Mr. Calloway. Her voice had not changed. Quiet. Controlled. But inside the boardroom, it carried authority now instead of politeness. Ethan looked toward the chairman. Why is a waitress in this meeting? No one laughed. No one even looked surprised. Claire opened the portfolio calmly and slid several documents across the table toward him. Confidential Internal Compliance Investigation. Ethan's jaw tightened as he read the first page. You have got to be kidding me. Claire finally sat down at the head chair directly across from him. The room remained perfectly silent except for the low hum of the city beyond the windows. For the last 6 months, Claire said evenly, I have been leading an independent audit authorized by Hawthorne International's Executive Oversight Committee. Ethan stared at her. No, yes. She tapped the folder lightly with one finger. Your acquisition numbers were flagged 3 quarters ago. Ethan let out a short, cold laugh. So this was what? Some kind of performance. Claire's eyes lifted calmly toward his. No, Mr. Calloway. She paused briefly. This was observation. The screen behind her changed suddenly. Financial charts. Internal transfers. Compliance violations highlighted in red across multiple subsidiaries. Ethan's face remained controlled, but his fingers tightened slowly around the silver pen resting beside his folder. Claire noticed immediately. Of course she did. The decimal point mattered, she said softly. And for the first time in years, Ethan Calloway realized he had walked into a room where he was no longer the most powerful person inside it. The silence inside the boardroom felt heavier than anger. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for coffee. 12 executives sat beneath the pale morning light staring at the glowing screen while lines of financial discrepancies scrolled slowly beside the Hawthorne logo. Claire Whitmore remained calm at the head of the table, one hand resting lightly against the black portfolio in front of her. Ethan. Calloway leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable now. But the silver pen between his fingers had stopped moving. This audit was conducted independently through executive oversight, Claire continued evenly. Every transfer, every deferred liability, every hidden subsidiary was reviewed over a 6-month period. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose. And your brilliant strategy involved pretending to serve cocktails? A few executives shifted uncomfortably at the sharpness in his voice. Claire did not react. People reveal themselves more honestly when they believe someone is beneath them. Ethan's eyes hardened instantly. Across the table, the chairman lowered his gaze toward the documents as if suddenly fascinated by paper. Claire pressed a button on the remote beside her. The screen changed again. Internal emails. Expense authorizations. Transfer chains connecting multiple shell accounts tied to the acquisition. Ethan recognized them immediately. Those transactions were approved by legal, he said coldly. Some were. Claire clicked to the next slide. Others were routed through discretionary authority, without board notification. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. You think this proves misconduct? I think it proves intent. The room went still again. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan traffic crawled through wet streets 42 floors below. Tiny yellow taxis moved like drifting lights beneath the gray morning sky. Ethan stood slowly from his chair. The movement alone changed the air inside the room. Even now, power followed him naturally. You know what I think, he said quietly. Claire looked up at him, without hesitation. I think this company has become so terrified of risk that it hired someone to play detective in a restaurant instead of understanding how business actually works. No one interrupted him. Ethan walked toward the screen slowly, adjusting the cuff of his suit jacket. Do you know why Hawthorne became worth $48 billion? He asked. Because people like me make impossible decisions while everyone else hides behind procedures. Claire watched him calmly. And procedures exist because people like. You believe rules are optional. Ethan turned sharply toward her. Careful. Claire did not blink. I was careful, Mr. Calloway. That is why we are here. A faint tension rippled through the room. One board member quietly removed his glasses. Another avoided looking at Ethan altogether now. Claire reached into the portfolio and removed a final document sealed beneath a dark blue cover page. Ethan recognized the executive watermark immediately. His expression changed for the first time all morning.
Barely.
But enough. No, he said quietly. Claire placed the folder directly in front of him. The Oversight Committee voted unanimously at 6:30 this morning. Ethan stared down at the document without touching it. Temporary executive suspension pending final review. The silver pen rested motionless beside his hand. You already made the decision before this meeting even started, he said. Claire folded her hands neatly together.
No.
The evidence did. Ethan laughed once under his breath. Not amusement. Something colder. More tired. All this, he murmured, because I underestimated a waitress. Claire's eyes lowered briefly toward the silver pen near his hand. The same pen he had mocked her over less than 12 hours earlier. No, she said softly, because you underestimated everyone. The words landed quietly. That was the worst part. No raised voice.
No cruelty.
Just truth placed carefully in the center of the table where nobody could avoid it anymore. Ethan finally picked up the suspension document. The room watched him in complete silence. His thumb paused briefly against the edge of the paper before he looked toward Claire again. Really looked at her this time. Not the uniform from last night. Not the waitress carrying whiskey through chandelier light. The woman sitting across from him now looked exactly where she belonged. And somehow that realization unsettled him more than the investigation itself. Outside, rainwater slid slowly down the glass tower while the city continued moving beneath them, unaware that one of the most powerful men in Manhattan had just stopped feeling untouchable. The meeting ended without anyone knowing exactly how to stand up. Afterward, chairs moved quietly against the polished floor. Folders closed with careful hands. Nobody looked directly at Ethan Calloway anymore. That was new. For years, executives had built entire careers around reading his moods before he entered a room. Now they slipped past him silently, like employees leaving a funeral. Ethan remained seated long after the others filed out. The suspension document still rested in front of him, untouched except for the faint crease near the corner, where his thumb had pressed too hard. Across the boardroom, Claire Whitmore gathered her papers with the same precise calm she had used while carrying wine glasses at Valmont House.
No dramatic expressions. No satisfaction.
Somehow that unsettled Ethan more than humiliation would have. You planned every detail, he said finally. Claire slid the final report into her portfolio. Planning is usually safer than improvising. Ethan let out a dry laugh beneath his breath. So the restaurant job was what? Research. Claire paused briefly before answering. Observation. The word echoed again between them. Ethan stood slowly from his chair and walked toward the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. Morning sunlight had finally begun breaking through the clouds, turning the wet streets below silver and gold. For the first time in years, he had nowhere urgent to be. No assistants waiting. No investors calling. Just silence. You know what the funny part is? He said quietly, still facing the glass. I almost respected you before all this. Claire looked at him carefully. Before what? Ethan turned slightly. Before I realized you were evaluating every word I said. Claire remained still for a moment. Then she stepped closer to the table and rested one hand lightly against the back of a leather chair. You think I came to destroy you? Did you not? Her eyes shifted briefly toward the suspension document. If I wanted destruction, this meeting would have looked very different. Ethan studied her face again, searching for arrogance. Victory. Anything. But Claire only looked tired now. Not emotionally tired. Older than that somehow. Like someone who had spent too long watching people disappoint themselves. Then why stay undercover? He asked. Why not walk in here 6 months ago wearing the suit? Claire glanced toward the skyline outside the windows. Because people speak differently to power. She paused. And because they speak honestly to waitresses. The words landed quietly again. Ethan hated how true they felt. He remembered the investors laughing at his jokes the night before. Remembered dismissing Claire without hesitation simply because she carried a tray instead of a title. The memory felt smaller now. Sharper too. Claire closed the portfolio and reached for her coat draped over the chair. The board will conduct a final review within 72 hours, she said professionally. Until then, your executive authority is suspended. Ethan nodded once. No anger this time. Just exhaustion settling slowly into his shoulders. Claire turned toward the door. Then Ethan spoke again before she could leave. That notebook, he said. Claire glanced back. The one behind the counter at the restaurant. Ethan frowned slightly. You carried internal audit notes while serving drinks? For the first time since entering the boardroom, something almost resembling amusement touched Claire's expression. Very faint. Gone almost immediately. People notice less than you think. Ethan looked down at the silver pen still resting beside the abandoned folder. He picked it up slowly and rolled it once between his fingers. I noticed you. Claire watched him quietly. Eventually, the room fell silent again. Outside, sunlight reflected against nearby skyscrapers while the city below continued rushing forward without pause. Ethan stared at the pen in his hand for a long moment before speaking again. "Last night," he said quietly, "when I said that thing about your paycheck," Claire interrupted gently. "I remember." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly toward the polished floor.
Not shame exactly.
Something quieter, less familiar. "I almost believed it," he admitted. Claire studied him for a second longer. Then she opened the boardroom door. "That was the problem, Mr. Calloway." Her voice remained calm.
Soft even.
"Most people do." And then she walked away, leaving. The door half opened behind her while sunlight slowly filled the room he no longer controlled. By late afternoon, the news had already spread across Manhattan. Not publicly. Not yet. But inside executive offices, private clubs, and quiet investment lunches, people had begun speaking Ethan Calloway's name more carefully than before. The markets had not reacted yet. Cameras still waited outside Hawthorne International, unaware of the storm building behind the glass tower. But inside the company, everything felt different. Assistants whispered softer. Doors closed faster. Even the elevators seemed quieter. Ethan stood alone inside his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park with his suit jacket folded over one arm and the city glowing pale gold beneath the evening sky. Normally, he would have been preparing for another dinner meeting by now. Another negotiation. Another acquisition. Instead, his phone sat face down on the marble kitchen counter beside 3 unanswered calls from investors who suddenly sounded less confident than yesterday. Ethan loosened his tie slowly and walked toward the window. 41 years old. Billionaire before 35. Youngest chief executive officer in company history. And somehow the image that would not leave his mind was not the boardroom. Not the audit reports. Not even the suspension notice. It was Claire Whitmore standing beneath chandelier light in a waitress uniform, asking whether he wanted another glass of whiskey. He remembered the exact moment now. The way she had caught the silver pen before it hit the floor. Calm hands. Calm eyes. No fear. How had he missed it? Ethan closed his eyes briefly, because he never looked closely at people serving him. Across the city, Claire sat alone near the back corner of a quiet cafe 3 blocks from Hawthorne International. Rainwater still clung faintly to the sidewalks outside while steam curled upward from untouched tea resting beside her notebook. The same black leather notebook Ethan had seen behind the restaurant counter. Internal risk exposure. Claire flipped through pages slowly, reviewing final compliance notes beneath the soft glow of a brass table lamp. Around her, conversations blurred into background noise. Students studying. A couple arguing quietly near the window. Espresso machines hissing behind the counter. Normal life. Temporary. Her phone vibrated once against the table. Unknown number. Claire stared at the screen for a second before answering. Whitmore. Silence lingered briefly on the other end before Ethan's voice arrived lower than usual. "You gave me your personal number during the investigation?" Claire closed the notebook carefully. It was attached to the compliance files. Ethan exhaled softly. "Right." Another silence followed.
Different this time.
Less hostile. Claire looked out through the cafe window toward the wet city street below. "Is there something you need, Mr. Calloway?" Ethan stood motionless inside the penthouse kitchen, one hand resting against the marble counter. He had no idea why he called. Powerful men usually called when they wanted solutions. Control. Leverage. None of those reasons felt true now. "I keep replaying last night," he admitted quietly. Claire waited. "The restaurant," Ethan clarified. "I thought I understood people." Claire's gaze drifted toward the passing headlights outside. "Most executives think they understand power," she said softly. "That is not the same thing." Ethan almost argued automatically. Almost. But exhaustion had stripped something away from him over the last 12 hours. The usual defenses sounded hollow now. "Did you hate me?" he asked suddenly. Claire blinked once at the question. Not because it offended her, because it sounded strangely sincere. "No," she answered honestly. That would have made the job easier. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the silver pen resting near his kitchen counter. He had brought it home without realizing. "Then what did you think when we first met?" Claire looked down at her tea for a long moment before speaking. "I thought you were someone who had forgotten what silence sounds like." Ethan said nothing after that. Outside his penthouse windows, Manhattan glittered endlessly beneath the darkening sky, while somewhere downtown a waitress carried drinks through another expensive dining room unnoticed by everyone around her. Finally, Ethan spoke again, quieter now. And now? Claire glanced toward her reflection in the cafe glass. Now, she said carefully, I think you finally heard it. Neither of them spoke afterward. The line remained open for a few seconds longer anyway. Just breathing. Just city noise drifting faintly through two different windows across Manhattan. 3 days later, Hawthorne International announced the decision quietly. No dramatic press conference. No public scandal. Just a carefully worded statement released shortly before the stock market closed on Friday afternoon. Ethan Callaway would step down pending permanent restructuring of executive leadership. Financial networks discussed it for less than one news cycle before moving on to the next corporate headline. Manhattan forgot quickly. It always did. But inside Hawthorne Tower, employees walked differently that day. Softer voices. Longer pauses near elevators. People who once lowered their eyes around Ethan now spoke freely in hallways lined with glass and marble. Claire Whitmore noticed all of it while standing near the 42nd floor windows reviewing final compliance transfers. The city below shimmered beneath cold evening rain again, headlights stretching into silver lines across wet avenues. You could have destroyed him completely. Claire looked up from the folder. Daniel Mercer, chairman of the Oversight Committee, stood near the doorway holding 2 untouched coffees. Claire accepted one politely. That was never the assignment. Daniel studied her carefully. Most people would not have shown restraint after the way he treated them. Claire wrapped both hands lightly around the warm cup. Most people enjoy revenge more than they admit. Daniel glanced toward the skyline outside. And you? Claire watched raindrops slide slowly down the glass. I enjoy accuracy. Daniel smiled faintly beneath his breath before leaving her alone again with the city lights and the low hum of the building after hours. Across Manhattan, Ethan sat alone inside a quiet jazz bar 2 blocks from Valmont House.
No assistance.
No security team. Just a dark wool coat draped beside him and untouched bourbon resting near his
hand.
The bartender recognized him immediately, but pretended not to. Ethan appreciated that more than he expected. The piano player near the back corner moved through a slow instrumental piece, while rain whispered softly against the windows facing Lexington Avenue. Ethan glanced toward the entrance each time the door opened without realizing he was doing it. Then, just after 9 o'clock, Claire walked inside. She wore a dark camel coat over a cream sweater now. No white suit.
No Waitress uniform.
Somehow both versions of her still felt equally controlled. Ethan straightened slightly in his chair. Claire noticed him immediately, but did not appear surprised. Mr. Callaway, she said calmly as she approached. Ethan almost smiled at the formality. I think we are past that now. Claire removed her gloves carefully before sitting across from him. The bartender approached quietly. Tea, Claire said softly. Earl Grey. Ethan remembered suddenly. She had ordered the same thing at the cafe 3 nights earlier. Strange what the mind chose to keep. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The piano continued softly behind them while amber light reflected against the polished wood bar. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. The board finalized everything this afternoon. Claire nodded once. I know. Ethan looked down at the glass in front of him. You were right about something. Claire waited. Ethan exhaled slowly. I spent so many years making people feel small that eventually I stopped seeing them at all. Claire's expression softened almost invisibly. Not pity. Something quieter. Understanding maybe. Power does that, she said. Ethan gave a tired laugh beneath his breath.
No.
Arrogance does. The bartender returned with Claire's tea and placed it gently on the table. Steam curled upward between them while rain blurred the city lights outside into soft rivers of gold. Ethan reached into his coat pocket slowly and placed something beside her cup. The silver fountain pen. Claire looked at it without touching it. I think this belongs to you now, Ethan said quietly. Claire's eyes rested on the pen for a long moment. Then she pushed it gently back across the table toward him. No, she replied softly. I think you've finally learned how to hold it. Ethan stared at the pen between them while the piano music drifted quietly through the room. Neither moved immediately. Outside, Manhattan continued rushing through the rain without noticing that somewhere inside a small jazz bar, a man who once measured worth by titles and salaries had fallen completely silent over the weight of a single silver pen. 2 weeks later, the rain finally disappeared from Manhattan. Winter sunlight spilled softly across Lexington Avenue while people hurried past Valmont House without looking up at the gold letters above the entrance. Inside the restaurant, the lunch crowd moved in quiet waves beneath crystal chandeliers and the low sound of piano music drifting through the dining room. Claire Whitmore adjusted a row of polished glasses behind the service counter while waiters crossed between tables carrying wine and linen baskets through warm amber light. Nothing about her movements had changed. Calm hands, straight posture, silence where most people filled space with noise. Naomi approached beside her carrying menus against one arm. "You know half the finance district is talking about Hawthorne," she whispered. Claire continued, aligning the glasses carefully. "People always need a story." Naomi lowered her voice further. "And you are seriously just coming back to work here like nothing happened?" Claire looked toward the dining room where sunlight reflected softly across untouched silverware. "It is quieter here." Naomi stared at her for a second before laughing under her breath and walking away shaking her head. The front door opened moments later with a soft chime. Claire did not look immediately. Another customer. Another expensive coat escaping the cold outside. But then the restaurant grew subtly quieter near the entrance. Not frozen, just aware. Claire lifted her eyes calmly. Ethan Calloway stood near the hostess station wearing a dark navy overcoat and carrying no phone in his hands for once. No assistant followed behind him. No investors. No board members. Just Ethan beneath the winter sunlight pouring through the glass doors. The hostess greeted him nervously. Ethan smiled politely and asked for a table near the windows. Claire noticed that too. Polite. The word once would have sounded strange beside his name. He removed his gloves slowly while taking the seat overlooking the city traffic outside. For several minutes, neither of them acknowledged the other directly. Claire carried coffee to another table, refilled water glasses, wrote an order onto her small black notepad. But eventually she approached his table with the same composed expression she had worn the first night they met. "Good afternoon," she said softly. "Can I get you something to drink?" Ethan looked up at her. Really looked this time. Not through her. Not past her. "Tea," he answered quietly. "Earl Grey." Claire paused for half a second, then nodded once. "Of course." She returned a few minutes later carrying the porcelain cup carefully balanced against the tray. Steam curled gently upward between them while sunlight touched the edge of the silver spoon beside his saucer. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his coat slowly. Claire watched him place something small onto the table near the sugar dish. The silver fountain pen. Polished now. Restored carefully. Claire's eyes rested on it silently. Ethan folded his hands together. "I kept thinking about what you said," he admitted. Claire adjusted the edge of the napkin near his cup. "People say many things." Ethan shook his head faintly. Not the words. His gaze drifted briefly toward the dining room around them. Waiters moving quietly. Glasses clinking softly. People rarely noticing the one serving them. "The way you looked at everyone," he said. "Like they mattered even when nobody else noticed them." Claire said nothing after that. She simply picked up the silver pen and turned it once slowly between her fingers beneath the warm chandelier light. Then, without ceremony, she slipped it gently into the front pocket of Ethan's coat. Her hand rested there for only a brief second before pulling away. "Careful with it this time," she said softly. Ethan almost smiled. Not the sharp practice smile from magazine covers and corporate interviews. Something smaller. Human. Claire turned to leave as another table called for service near the far side of the restaurant. Halfway across the dining room, she paused briefly beside the windows overlooking Lexington Avenue. Outside, people continued rushing through the city without looking up. Inside, Ethan wrapped both hands quietly around the warm teacup and watched the waitress move calmly through the crowded room like she had never needed anyone to recognize her worth in the first place. The piano drifted softly through the restaurant while winter light settled across the marble floors in long golden lines. And for the first time in a very long while, Ethan Calloway did not feel the need to be the loudest person in the room. Sometimes respect arrives quietly enough that only silence knows it happened.